Welcome back. This is Module 6 of Consciousness, Creativity, and Contribution. I ended our previous session by stating that what we do for ourselves alone dies with us, but what we do to contribute to others and to the world remains and is immortal. This final module of Consciousness, Creativity, and Contribution is about legacy. Your legacy, the lasting impact you will have on the world. Now, of course, there is no way to know what your actual legacy may end up being. Neither the author of that self-help book nor that bookbinder could have known in advance the enormous impact they would have on not just the life of Michael Faraday, but also the whole scientific world. However, both Isaac Watts and George Ribot set out to do something that would create an impact. Watts wrote his book intending to inspire people to self-actualize, and Ribot intended to influence the young mind of Faraday. Their intentions created a legacy that has lived on past their temporal existence, and you can do so also. Another example of a man who, seemingly anonymously, had a large impact on the world we live in is, ironically, a man by the name of William Small. Now, we all know the legacy of Thomas Jefferson. He drafted the Constitution of the United States and is, still today, respected around the world as a leading voice of individual sovereignty and personal responsibility. But most do not know that William Small was instrumental in the intellectual development of Jefferson. He instilled in Jefferson a lifelong appreciation of science, of math, and of the European Enlightenment thinkers like Isaac Newton, John Locke, and Francis Bacon. And importantly, he also taught Jefferson the Socratic method of thinking. This method of thinking is behind all creative endeavors, so let's take a brief look at it. Basically, the Socratic method is the skill of critical thinking. It is based on asking questions. Questions like, why do you hold that opinion? Upon what assumptions, data, or beliefs is it based? Is there another way to see things? Is that other perspective viable? Can it be arrived at with the same data? What results come out of holding that opinion or perspective you hold? Are those results or consequences the best possible outcome? If you change the way you see things, could you produce better consequences? If there was a desired ideal result, what opinions, beliefs, and ways of thinking might serve to produce that result? Why do things happen the way they do? What changes might you make to produce more desired results? These are questions inspired by what has come to be called the Socratic method of thinking. But perhaps it should rightfully be called the Aspasian method of critical thinking. I will explain why I say that in a few minutes. But first, some critical thinking. Jefferson, along with the other founding fathers of the United States of America, asked themselves what form of government might lead to a culture of individual sovereignty and personal responsibility and enable the self-actualization of individual human beings through the natural rights defined by John Locke, including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson drafted the document that he thought would form the basis of a government that would enable that to develop. He used the Socratic method to think about how to best implement and realize Locke's natural rights in a culture. Okay, now back to those Socratic or Aspasian thinking skills. This is another story of a legacy that stretches over time, like the story of Faraday's mentors and legacy. Countless other examples like those of Faraday and Jefferson exist. Those world changers all had teachers, mentors, or patrons who shaped the mind of those individuals whose contributions have historical significance. And those teachers, patrons, and mentors each in turn had their own major influencers. And while it can be rightly said that a relatively unknown professor of mathematics and philosophy, William Small, directly helped forge the American Republic by instilling certain ideas into Jefferson's young mind, we have to dig deeper to see the true origin. Allow me to explain with a very interesting story that takes place over centuries. Take a deep breath and follow this train of thought, this chain of linkages. American democracy in the form of a constitutional republic came into being influenced by the ideas of a woman from ancient Athens who was the lover of the greatest proponent of the original Athenian form of democracy, a guy by the name of Pericles. Let's first take a look at some events at the dawn of the American Republic. The city of Alexandria, Virginia, was founded in 1749 and was named after Captain John Alexander, who held a 500-acre tobacco farming estate that encompassed the settlement that had grown up around the tobacco warehouse. When it became apparent that that small settlement of stores and houses would develop into a larger permanent settlement, it became clear that order should be brought to its growth. So the original town site was surveyed and registered by a young surveyor by the name of George Washington. The layout and the streets were designated by that survey. A quarter of a century later, in 1775, a local tavern came into being in Alexandria that would, in 1792, come to be named Gatsby's Tavern. It became a favorite watering hole of the now famous architect and revolutionary general, George Washington, as well as other founding fathers of the young republic, James Monroe, James Madison, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. You can imagine the type of conversations that took place there over a good meal and a few pints of beer. Hold that thought while we travel back in time. The city of Alexandria, Egypt, was founded 21 centuries earlier by Alexander the Great in 331 BC and quickly grew to become the largest city in the ancient world until it was eclipsed by Rome many, many years later. And what was once the greatest depository of human knowledge, the Great Library of Alexandria, was built at the behest of Alexander the Great by Ptolemy I, who was appointed Pharaoh of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Now, most folks think of Alexander as a great warrior and empire builder, but he was also a scholar who was taught by Aristotle, who in turn was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates, whose major intellectual influence was a woman by the name of Aspasia, an intellectual powerhouse and the lover of the great Pericles of Athens, who had built the Parthenon and promoted Athenian democracy and culture. Aspasia personally taught the logical skill of rhetoric to Socrates, who, as I said, went on to teach Plato, who is today credited as being the father of Western philosophical thought. As one of my favorite philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead, wrote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." So, whether you know it or not, you think the way you think about the world and your place in it largely because of Plato's ideas. Plato's legacy is enormous. We all live our mental lives shaped largely by the ideas and insights of Plato, and he gets just credit for the philosophical basis of Western culture, as rightfully so does his teacher Socrates, whom Plato credits with his education. So it can be said that Western culture is their shared legacy. But think about this. Would Plato have learned to think and philosophize without the indirect influence of the teacher of Socrates, that reputed courtesan and keeper of a brothel, Aspasia? Perhaps all of Western philosophical thought is, at least partially, her legacy, as was the popularization of the idea of democracy through her pillow talk influence on Pericles. Or perhaps was it actually her parents who had educated her and instilled in her a love of knowledge and a strong sense of independence, freedom of thought and expression? Is Western culture actually their legacy? Did the ripples of their parenting skills impact the development of Western culture, the founding of the USA, and the way you think and conceptualize reality? Now imagine, what future impact and legacy might your own parenting skills or choice to act as a mentor to a young mind have on the development of human culture? As I said in the previous module of this course, each of us creates ripples in space-time as we live our lives, just as a canoeist leaves ripples in the lake as he moves across its surface. As we each dip our paddles into the waters of existence to chart our personal course, we create those ripples that move out and change the environment we move through. And even though that change may seem transient and may even go unnoticed, we cannot help but have an effect. Okay, now let's cycle back to that patron of the pub known as Gatsby's Tavern, Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the American Constitution in the summer of 1787. William Small had introduced him to the works of John Locke. John Locke's major impact were the concepts of natural law and natural rights, Locke was, like his contemporary and friend Isaac Newton, a student of the writings of Plato, whose ideas included natural laws and natural rights. So, can it be said that the foundation of two cities named Alexandria and the Constitution of the United States is the legacy of the parents of that woman of mystery, Aspasia? We all leave ripples in space-time. Some, like Bucky Fuller, set out to create a legacy that will impact the world. Most folks, however, are solely focused on paddling their own canoe and have not yet chosen to intentionally become, like Bucky, a trim tab that can change the direction of the whole big ship of society. Okay, allow me to share one more little story. There was, once upon a time, a man who spent many years speaking to people within his city, doing his best to instruct people to live in harmony with the creative and binding force which runs through the universe. But no one would listen. Coming to the conclusion that his message was falling on deaf ears, he decided to leave and go live a life of solitude and contemplation in the countryside. However, as he attempted to leave the city, he was stopped at the city gate by a guard who refused to let him pass until he wrote down his teaching. That man was Lao Tzu, and what he wrote in order to be allowed to leave the city was the Tao Te Ching. Over the centuries, that work and the Taoist philosophy that arises from it has made a major impact on not just the lives of many creative and contributory people, but on the collective consciousness of all humanity. Lao Tzu deservedly gets credit for leaving an incredible legacy. But without that anonymous soldier who was guarding the city gate that day, that legacy may not ever have been created. Lao Tzu had thought his message was falling on deaf ears, but apparently that guard deemed it worthy of being recorded and shared with the world. Now, you may not ever have studied that epic work, but you have been influenced by people who have, and so has our entire culture. For example, the concepts of yin and yang are Taoist concepts. Numerous people whose own thoughts, words, and deeds have had an enormous impact on the world have themselves credited the Tao Te Ching for being a major influence on the way they chose to live their lives. Among them are the writers Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oscar Wilde, Stuart Wilde, Alan Watts, and Leo Tolstoy. Okay, hold that thought. Let's look at a couple of other notable world changers, people whose legacy we all recognize. I ask you to ask yourself this question: why did a somewhat mediocre and unknown lawyer set out to free his country from its imperialist overlords? We know that he was motivated by witnessing the effects of racism and imperialism, but how did Mahatma Gandhi come to believe he could accomplish that? Gandhi himself claims that his greatest inspiration was Leo Tolstoy. Tolstoy may have penned two of the greatest novels ever written, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. But it was his lesser known work, The Kingdom of God is Within You, that inspired Gandhi. Now, Tolstoy, in turn, credits that legendary Chinese sage, Lao Tzu, as being amongst his greatest influences. And of course, we must also remember that Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by both Gandhi and Tolstoy. So it can be said that the profound accomplishment of the icon of the civil rights movements in the United States is, at least partially, the indirect legacy of Chinese Taoist philosophy. Was in fact the legacy of that anonymous guard at the gate partially responsible for the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr.? Interesting thought, isn't it? As I said, you may never know what your legacy may be and what impact you may have on the future unfolding for not just one other person's life, but for all of humanity. The book you pass on, the opportunity you share, the encouragement you give, even just the smile you gift to a stranger on the street may end up having an impact that ripples out through the future in ways that you could never predict. Now imagine what impact you could have if you set the intention to go out and change the world. Imagine the impact you could have if you went about living your life in such a way as to contribute your unique gifts to the world in order to improve and uplift the lives of your fellow human beings. Now, we often look at the lives of notable people through the lenses of our own motivation. We may think, for example, that the inventor of the assembly line, Henry Ford, for example, was simply a hard-nosed entrepreneur focused on making money for himself. But listen to what he had to say. To do more for the world than the world does for you, that is success. Pretty profound statement for that stubborn old builder of the Model T horseless carriage. We may also tend to think of Elon Musk the same way, as just some billionaire entrepreneur with bigger toys than most people. And we may be of the opinion that his building of rockets to take people to Mars is just megalomania. But listen to what he has to say about his motivation. I wake up every day and ask myself what I can do to create a better future for myself and for the world. Now, obviously, not all of us are going to make the kind of impact on the world like Michael Faraday or Henry Ford or Elon Musk or Lao Tzu or Martin Luther King Jr. But we can each contribute in our own way to the betterment of our fellow human beings. And once we make the decision to do that, instead of, or in addition to, pursuing our own personal gratification, we have begun the process of creating a meaningful personal legacy. The purpose of this course is to inspire and encourage you to do just that, to become all you can be in order to create and contribute more. Now, of course, the principles of success that are explained here on Delphin World will work for you even if your motivation is solely the creation of your own material success. But they will also serve if you choose to create a legacy that will be a contribution to your fellow human beings tomorrow and in the years ahead. And I encourage you to consider that greater happiness, a deeper sense of personal fulfillment, and more success will come to you if and when you set the intention to be of service to your fellow human beings. Being of service to your fellows does not mean sacrificing your own needs, wants, and desires. Being of service means utilizing your skills, attributes, and resources to do both, to live a life of ease and abundance while making the world a better place. I have said it before. It is not spiritually or ethically superior to forego personal material abundance. You are here to partake of the abundance that life has to offer as much as you are here to contribute to the ongoing self-actualization of your fellow human beings and of the universe itself. You create your legacy by the actions you take to enact your ideals. Those ideals can be limited to your personal aspirations, or they can be for the greater good of your community, your society, or humanity as a whole. Given that your legacy is that which lives on beyond your temporal physical existence, one very effective way to get clear about what kind of legacy you would like to leave is to ask yourself, what would you like people to say about you at your funeral? Now, I'm going to offer you this additional following exercise as a way of establishing not just clarity about your real, rather than fanciful, ideals, but also as a way of setting specific benchmarks that you can use to validate your intentionality and to ensure that you are bringing a sense of meaning and purpose to the way you live your life. Take a day to think about it, and then sit down and write your own obituary. If you choose to do this deliberately and thoughtfully, it will provide an enormous bit of personal insight, in addition to giving you the clarity of purpose. I asked you to ask yourself what you would like people to say about you at your funeral. Now I am asking you to ask yourself what you would like to be able to say about how you lived your life and what impact you had on the world. Although we can see some immediate effects that we have created in our world, we will never know the fullness of that legacy we end up leaving. That being said, we can intentionally go about establishing personal ideals, setting personal goals, and then go about living in such a way as to make an intentional impact on the world. It is my belief that simply because each human being is unique, each has unique gifts, talents, skills, and contributions that can be expressed out into the world, that deserve to be expressed out into the world, and that should be expressed out into the world. And if they are not, the world ends up a smaller place than it could have been. So how do we do that? Create that impact upon the world and leave that personal legacy? The answer is, as Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. When we discover that which enables us to feel most alive, we lose the limited, egocentric sense of ourselves in doing that thing. It becomes our purpose and our passion. And in expressing that purpose and passion, we become a greater sense of self, and we create the biggest impact. You create your legacy by striving to become the best version of yourself and by expressing that version of yourself through your creativity. And, of course, it all begins in your self-aware consciousness. Okay, that's it for this session and for the philosophical discussion of consciousness, creativity, and contribution. Next month, we will get into the real, proven, practical steps you can implement to create your own personal success and, in so doing, create a personal legacy that may indeed ripple through the centuries ahead. I look forward to you engaging in the Live Success Now modules that await you. Thank you for being the wonderful and wonder-filled, self-actualizing human being that you are. Ciao for now.